Right now, the front has exploded. The Ukrainian armed forces wiped out 2 enemy companies, hundreds of casualties, equipment in ruins. These footage are going viral. In Russia itself, it's a real hell. Explosions are booming one after another, and there's no place to hide anymore. Japan has given Ukraine weapons that see everything. Crimea is on fire. Tatarstan is ablaze after a drone attack. And near Kupiansk and Kherson, there are heaps of occupiers' coffins. All of this and more in our segment Hot Spot. A massive slaughter on the front. The occupiers launched an attack near Pokrovsk and paid the price. The Ukrainian armed forces obliterated 2 enemy companies. Hundreds of dead, dozens wounded, and a lot of destroyed equipment. The Russian plan to capture the Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka highway has failed again. How the Ukrainian armed forces thwarted the enemy's offensive and turned it into a real hell, we show you right now.
2 companies of Russians on motorcycles and armored vehicles in a single assault. The occupiers attempted to break through our front in the Pokrovsk direction. The Russians tried to push through to the Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka highway to cut off communication routes between 2 groups of Ukrainian troops. If they had succeeded, the situation around Pokrovsk and in the Toretsk area would have become significantly more complicated. However, 2 companies of occupiers now lie in the fields of Donbas. 240 Russians were destroyed, another 30 wounded. Nearly 100 motorcyclists and more than 20 armored vehicles were burned. This was one of the largest enemy assaults in the sector in recent times and was successfully repelled.
The enemy deployed a large amount of equipment in the battle, this time mostly combat armored vehicles and motorcycles, as well as about 2 companies of personnel. But our defenders demonstrated true professionalism and invincibility.
And this is already a large-scale mechanized assault. The occupiers are trying to break through in the Novopavlovsk direction. They launched an attack with more than 24 armored vehicles, several tanks, over a dozen BMPs with infantry, and they burned in the fields. Every single one. Enemy infantrymen who jumped off the burning armored vehicles were located and destroyed by FPV drones operated by the pilots of the 71st Jaeger Airborne Brigade. In anticipation of that enemy assault, Ukrainian soldiers managed to secure new positions and push back the Russians in the village of Dniproenergia in the Volnovakha district. Consequently, the Vuhledar Tactical Group announced, the settlement is under the control of the defense forces. However, the enemy has not stopped their assaults there and is trying to regain what was lost.
Have you already moved up according to the task?
And this is our observation drone capturing the movement of 2 occupiers in the area of the village of Zaporizhia in the Donetsk region. They are the only ones left after the latest enemy assault was just defeated.
An assault group of 7 people is moving towards our positions.
Ukrainian FPV drones are already heading towards them. The occupiers are trying to hide in the still not too dense fresh greenery. And even among the branches, our pilots see them and immediately destroy them.
3-pointer. 3-pointer. One is moving, one is twitching his legs.
In these frames, it's actually the disposal of a Russian soldier by his own commanders. Otherwise, it can't be called anything else, say the warriors. Each of the enemy stormtroopers knows. Even if he's wounded, his own won't take him. Here's the proof. An occupier shredded by the debris of our drone still moves forward leaning on a stick because there's no way back. His own will kill him there.
Today we have at night.
Tonight we had another suicide case who, after completing his task, took and shot himself. He didn't think about going back. They don't have the thought of running away, they just go forward, that's it. There are no other options. Either they die here or there, well, that's how it seems to me. How else to understand their actions if they still go forward with injuries? Here are the shots of the nighttime soldier suicide. So a Russian decided to help the Ukrainian army by shooting himself and saving our drone's ammunition.
You can see him lying down turning over the rifle. And before that, 3 drops were made on him. He got fed up with everything and decided to shoot himself. Well, maybe death is easier that way than from the drops. Probably not as painful.
The life of a Russian assault soldier in such foot assaults is 2 hours, say Ukrainian warriors. From the moment our drones spot the enemy group to the stage when Russian soldiers are allowed into the so-called kill zone. This is the area where our strike drone can reach. But despite the losses, Kremlin commanders still push their subordinates forward, sparing neither equipment nor showing any pity for their soldiers.
Since the beginning of the day, there have already been 69 battles on the front line. The most Russian assaults are in the Pokrovsk direction. Note the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. In this area, the occupiers are using a new tactic, attacks on motorcycles. Since we have disrupted their logistical routes, the Russians cannot bring heavy equipment to the front line. Therefore, they are forced to attack using motorcycles and infantry. Every day we observe motorcycle attacks. This week, we recorded 13 hits on enemy motorcycles from mortars of various calibers. Yesterday, for example, our 1st Battalion alone destroyed 3 motorcycles. Pavel Vyshibava, a mortar operator of the 68th Separate Jaeger Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, in an interview with Suspilnet. In the Siversk direction alone, up to 100 units of Russian motorized equipment were destroyed just in the past week, the military says. Usually, the groups consist of 3 to 5 motorcyclists. There is a distribution of roles: assault motorcyclist, mining motorcyclist, evacuation motorcyclist, and even a motorcyclist with electronic warfare equipment. The Russians are betting on the mobility of motorcycles, hoping to break through the drone control zone. However, the main reason for such tactics is the heavy losses of armored vehicles on the battlefield. Dmytro Zaproshets, spokesperson for the Luhansk Operational Tactical Group, on the air of the United News Marathon. In the Lyman sector, Ukrainian forces successfully repelled Russian assaults in the area of Nadia, Luhansk region, as well as Redkodub, Kolodyazy, and Yampilivka in the Donetsk region. The enemy also attempted to advance in the areas of Zarizov, Novakubliakivka, Krasnepeshe, Mala Shapkovka, and Volchansk in the Kharkiv region. In the Luhansk region, partisans destroyed a transformer cabinet on the railway near Stanitsia Luhanska. Along this track, Russian occupiers were transporting resources to supply their troops, as well as military equipment and personnel.
The result of the successfully conducted sabotage was a disruption in the logistics of the occupying forces, causing delays in the delivery of equipment and spare parts. We continued to systematically strike the transport infrastructure that the occupiers use for their purposes, and in the near future there will be more and more such strikes. From a message by the partisan movement Atesh on Telegram.
Meanwhile, the Russians continue to suffer unprecedented losses in the Kursk region.
The chronicle of the Kurskan operation is not over. It continues because today this operation fulfills the main task, creating a buffer zone so that the enemy cannot transfer, including their reserves, let's say on a larger scale, to other sections of the Russian-Ukrainian war front. Today we clearly see that the defense forces managed to not only to repel the enemy's onslaught. There, a group of more than 90,000 has gathered. We remember how it all started. Initially, the North group numbered about 10,000, and today it's 90. That is, Russia has been forced to increase its resource usage 9 times, but to hold back the offensive actions of the defense forces.
To make up for losses, Russia continues to recruit foreigners, reports the UK Ministry of Defense.
Most foreign citizens sign contracts due to financial incentives and the prospect of obtaining Russian citizenship. It is quite likely that many foreign citizens are recruited specifically through Moscow thanks to higher signing bonuses. From the UK Ministry of Defense's message on social network X.
The occupiers have come up with a new trick to break through the front. Russian generals have decided to storm the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces on motorcycles. The Iron Horses are supposedly meant to deceive Ukrainian drones. But is this realistic, or are they facing another bloodbath? Why might this tactic of desperation turn into a real slaughter for the Russians? All the details of the new insane tactic right now.
We are here at the training ground where the motorcycle group of the Volunteer Brigade Española will be practicing tasks and maneuvers. The group was formed literally 2 weeks ago, based on the assault unit.
Russia is preparing a new offensive tactic for spring-summer. This is reported by analysts from the American Institute for the Study of War. According to their information, the occupiers are now replacing armored vehicles with motorcycles.
And these motorcycle, units have already appeared as the combat confrontation intensified. Naturally, today tactical methods are being developed on our side to counteract this. It is clear that the target is small, and it is actually very difficult to hit it with a drone. That's obvious.
Experts note that the Kremlin is switching to motorcycle groups for several reasons. The main reason is, of course, the multiple increase in the number of FPV drones of the armed forces of Ukraine. The Russians themselves do not hide the fact that Ukrainian UAV operators have become so skilled at destroying their counterparts that a target the size of a passenger car is no longer a problem for them. Therefore, Russia is now looking for the smallest and fastest means of transportation possible.
More maneuverable than a car. And also, even if you take these FPV drones, well, I don't think they would use FPV drones just for a motorcycle.
Moreover, the tactic of advancing on motorcycles seems to have been initiated directly from the Russian General Staff. After all, satellite images regularly capture training of future suicide bombers on two-wheeled vehicles at the training grounds. Meanwhile, armored vehicles are hardly used in exercises.
If operators see an armored personnel carrier, then it's clear. That's a crew plus about 10 more orcs. It's a combat vehicle. Destroying one such combat vehicle immediately multiplies the result by 10. A motorcyclist, a lone motorcyclist, or a lone running orc is a target, but you have to scale it up tenfold to destroy each one individually. That's why the Russian suicide bombers are trying to use all possible light means of transportation to increase their mobility.
However, analysts note that in this way, the Russian command is primarily preserving equipment, not people. Since the start of the full-scale war, Russia has already lost more than 10,500 in tanks alone. Therefore, the remnants of the surviving armored vehicles are now being guarded like the apple of their eye.
70 to 80% of the cases of using heavy armored vehicles, especially tanks, involve tasks that are not typical for tanks. This is essentially carrying out artillery operations from concealed positions. This is not tank combat.
Meanwhile, no one intends to spare the assault troops. Get on a two-wheeler and go forward. The occupiers, on the other hand, are trying to protect themselves, habitually using old tactics like grills on armor.
This is the kind of protection for a motorcycle. They made a mesh. Is this how you will protect against FPV?
Yes,
And will you use it for combat missions or evacuation?
for combat missions.
For combat missions. On such a beauty, it needs to be painted green.
However, protecting with a mesh over the motorcycle from a strike drone is a pointless idea, as the shrapnel will still hit the driver. Therefore, more experienced motorcycle assault troops say, if you hear a Ukrainian drone, only your reaction can save you.
At the very last moment, yes, when you already feel it at the back of your head, you need to move left or right. This can save your life.
It is worth mentioning that there are motorcycle units in the Ukrainian army as well. However, they are used quite differently. Instead of pointless frontal assaults, our military bikers operate under aerial cover and ride not so much for attacks, but for delivering ammunition and supplies, as well as for evacuating the wounded.
We also adopt some elements of enemy tactics, among other things. We also have units that have switched to these metal steeds and will also be harassing the forward positions of the Russian troops. Therefore, we take the best and use the best, including what the enemy has, and prepare countermeasures.
Russia is in panic. Powerful explosions are shaking the regions, and this is just a warm-up. Now, Ukraine has received secret weapons from Japan. Satellite images that see everything through concrete and fog. The Kremlin is in shock. There's no way to hide. Why is a country that has always stayed on the sidelines now helping Ukraine? And what does this mean for Russia? Find out right now.
Numerous successful strikes on refineries.
Air! Air! Come here behind the concrete wall. 100. It's fine, the fragments won't get through.
Military depots, bases, and Russian military-industrial complex facilities.
It's fine! It's fine, you...
All of this would have been impossible without one crucial detail: satellite reconnaissance. The land of the rising sun has agreed for the first time in history to provide data from Japanese satellites to Ukrainian intelligence. Japan has agreed to provide geospatial data to the Ukrainian intelligence community. This is new territory for Japan, and it carries its own set of risks. The Ukrainian GUR has signed a cooperation agreement with the Japanese IQPS Institute, which owns 5 satellites in orbit. Now, radar images taken with SAR satellites will be utilized by Ukrainian intelligence. Japan has become the 4th country to provide Ukraine with such SR images. Ukraine already has access to SAR systems from Finland's AISY, Germany's SAR Lab, SARA, and Italy's Cosmo Skymed 1 and 2, now Japan IQPS. The agreement provides for the integration of systems owned by the Japanese IQPS Institute into the platforms used by the Ukrainian Main Intelligence Directorate. Experts and analysts separately note the supply of SAR data from Japan, which is generated using synthetic aperture radar technology and significantly aids Ukrainian intelligence.
The Main Intelligence Directorate of the Ministry of Defense uses satellite imagery data to determine the locations of permanent and temporary deployment of personnel, the movement of units of Russian occupation forces, the permanent locations of air defense, missile defense systems, electronic warfare systems, that is, legitimate military targets, both in the temporarily occupied areas of Ukraine and accordingly on the territory of the Russian Federation.
SAR satellites can create high-resolution images regardless of weather conditions or time of day. In addition, they allow for the identification of even the smallest objects on the Earth's surface. Thanks to this, the armed forces of Ukraine will have an advantage in observation, target acquisition, reconnaissance, or their own positioning on the battlefield.
Thanks to the availability of satellite images, strikes were carried out on airfields totaling 370, more than 200 on positions of air and missile defense systems, and 153 strikes on oil refineries and oil depots. In addition, about 20 strikes were carried out on naval bases.
In light of Washington's provocative statements and decisions regarding the suspension of military aid and, most importantly, the exchange of intelligence information, the search for alternative sources of high-tech satellite data is a matter of Ukraine's ability to detect and strike the enemy, both directly on the front and deep in the rear.
Britain announced an aid package for Ukraine amounting to $580 million.
After the situation that has developed now, with our American partners and the policy that Trump is pursuing, today, Europe has finally, well, let's say cooled off from all those rose-colored glasses it was wearing. And that sluggish policy towards Ukraine has now shifted to a more serious policy.
The British Ministry of Defense stated that the aid package is aimed at funding the rapid delivery of FPV drones to attack targets and drop explosives on Russian positions.
The war is completely different now, so it dictates different conditions. And the Europeans and Americans know how to analyze, conduct analysis, and carry out competent intelligence on Ukrainian territory, understanding what the current conditions of the war in Ukraine dictate. Accordingly, they understand that FPV drones are currently the most effective weapon for combating the Russian Federation. I'll explain why. Roughly speaking, one 155 caliber ammunition costs about $2,800 to $3,000 per shell. For the price of one shell, we can buy about 4 to 5 FPV drones.
The drones that are planned to be purchased from British and Ukrainian suppliers are considered particularly effective. According to the British Ministry of Defense, they account for 60 to 70 damages inflicted on Russian equipment in Ukraine.
Today, drones of various types play a very significant role on the battlefield. Today, Pononoidze drones maintain the kill zone in all directions, which is necessary for us to prevent the enemy from advancing, even at a tactical level, for example.
It has been stated that the funds will be used to purchase radar systems, anti-tank mines, as well as for the repair and maintenance of vehicles and equipment.
First of all, a big thank you to our allies and partners for ensuring that aid to Ukraine continues. It is all significant. And most importantly, our allies are responding to the maximum extent to what Ukraine needs today in order to continue conducting a defensive strategic operation, to continue resisting the aggression of the Russian Federation. And it is evident that today, if air defense issues are raised, we see the response, including from our allies, and Germany's statement in particular that new IRIS systems will be supplied to Ukraine.
Speaking of the effectiveness of drones in the Ukrainian-Russian war, Alexander Syrsky recently discussed this. The Ukrainian commander-in-chief stated that Ukraine was responsible for the crash of the strategic bomber Tu-22M3. Moreover, this was achieved in the same way as most successful strategic drone strikes. In Russia, it was claimed that a technical malfunction allegedly led to the destruction of the bomber.
The British calculated correctly and determined that the amount they would supply us with FPV drones might be sufficient for us to shift our priorities regarding offensive activities closer to mid-May, when the ground dries up and conditions become favorable, and we have identified the enemy's weak spots. We will be able to transition from active defense to a counter-offensive operation.
The UK Defence Minister John Gilly, addressing other members of the group, stated that the work of the countries that met on Friday under the collective name Ukraine Defence Contact Group is vital to position Ukraine as strongly as possible and to put pressure on Putin to stop this terrible war.
After all, today it's not just about Ukraine holding back Russian aggression. It's about Ukraine winning this fight. And with the help of allies, ensuring that very just the peace we are talking about. And a just peace precisely involves neutralizing the aggression of the Russian Federation today on the battlefield and further in the military, political and geopolitical situation that will develop, particularly on the European continent and indeed throughout the world.
The EU ambassador to Ukraine, Katerina Matanova, stated on April 10th that almost half of the European Union's tranche of 2.1 billion euros obtained from the revenues of frozen Russian assets will be directed towards procurement for the Ukrainian defense industrial complex under the so-called Danish model.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now. Tatarstan is on fire, the deadly UAV of the armed forces of Ukraine. The footage will shock you. Meanwhile, the occupiers are in agony again. While Russian war criminals are killing peaceful Ukrainians, their infantry near Kupiansk is being ground into meat. Also, a video has appeared online showing coffins of soldiers who fought in the Kherson direction. It is there that the enemy is suffering colossal losses. Watch the full story for all the details.
The Russian occupiers cannot hide, and the Ukrainian defense forces are destroying the enemy. An engineer in the armed forces of Ukraine struck using a Vampire UAV on an underground shelter where the enemy was hiding. And this is already on the Kharkiv direction. Ukrainian fighters used a UAV to destroy a platoon of occupiers and enemy equipment. This means that the families of Russian occupiers who went to war against Ukraine continue to receive coffins. This time, the unpleasant package came from the Kherson region. To justify the losses and supposedly show their strength, the occupiers have intensified shelling of populated areas. First, they drop aerial bombs and then they cover the same area with artillery.
Russia does not exclusively attack civilian infrastructure in the territory controlled by the Northern Sun. Primarily, it is about striking objects and infrastructure. That is, they are trying to create chaos or panic and, thank you, distrust towards the actions of central and local authorities. It should be noted that the Russian side's ability to conduct large-scale airborne operations in this area has been reduced to almost zero.
And the Russian occupation army does not cease its attempts to capture Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. However, despite all the efforts that Russia has made over the past few months, their attempts are in vain. The invaders were unable to approach the city.
At the moment, Ukrainian defense forces have pushed back the occupiers by 2.5 kilometers from Pokrovsk, from the positions they previously held. Moreover, there is a prospect of restoring the location of Ukrainian defense forces in the Mezhivor area. In addition, on the second flank in the area of the settlement of Shevchenko, the Ukrainian defense forces are preventing the enemy from expanding their zone of presence.
And while the Russians are making new plans, the Ukrainian armed forces are taking action. The Ukrainian army is already deploying the latest robots on the front, writes the Telegraph. One of the representatives of combat technology is the Snake robot. In 2025, Ukraine plans to deploy up to 15,000 such platforms.
This is a ground robot designed for demining missions. It should be noted that, according to Ukrainian specialists' assessments and technical specifications, this robot allows for demining up to 2 and twice as much in mined areas. It moves close to the ground, detects mines, and is remotely operated by an operator from a protected wing. This minimizes the possibility of direct impact on the operator of this ground threshold.
Ukraine is focused on creating robots on a large scale that will assist the armed forces on the front line. There are examples of this. A separate unit of the Unmanned Systems Force.
The Ukrainian side is scaling up the direct use of combat drones in real combat conditions. In addition, the Ukrainian side is taking an innovative approach to the development of unmanned aerial vehicles. We are talking about FPV drones. These are designed specifically for the direct neutralization of Russian drones, reconnaissance units, and accordingly, Geran-2 strike drones.
But in Russia, it was once again very loud and bright. This is one of the largest ammunition depots burning, the 51st Arsenal of the Main Missile and Artillery Directorate. According to some reports, this warehouse can store about 270,000 tons of ammunition, artillery shells, rockets for MLRs, SAM components, and tactical missiles like Tochka-U.
The distance from the line of combat contact to the 61st Grayu arsenal itself is about 530 to 550 kilometers. Notably, the distance from the arsenal itself to the capital of the occupying country is about 60 kilometers. It should be noted that this area is the most saturated with air defense and missile defense systems.
This is already the fourth Grau arsenal destroyed since the year 24. In total, there are 11 such facilities in Russia.
These are colossal losses for the Russian side. It should be noted that according to estimates by the Ukrainian intelligence community, after the destruction of 3 Grau depots in the year 2024, the intensity of fire damage by the Russian Federation decreased significantly. If previously there were up to 40,000 shells per day, then after the destruction of the Grau depots, this figure decreased to approximately 16 to 17,000.
It would be better for the Russians to strengthen their leaky air defense as the number of depots is becoming fewer and fewer. And who knows, maybe the 5th one is already in the crosshairs.
Meanwhile, the Ukrainian armed forces are fiercely dismantling the 112th Guards Rocket Brigade of the Russian Federation. Unique footage. And once again, Crimea has been shaken. The latest Ukrainian UAVs are in action. The Russians are in a frenzy, and at this time a Russian plane drops bombs on their own. It's a real hell in the Belgorod region. We will tell you all the details right now.
Revenge did not take long. These are the shots of the shelling of the 112th Guards Rocket Brigade.
Look at this! Watch!
This is the very brigade that was killing Ukrainians in the city of Sumy on Sunday. Well, here's your answer.
Damn! I almost gave birth. Oh, I've got goosebumps.
Interestingly, for the protection of such an object, the Russians spared the air defense and unsuccessfully tried to shoot down the UAVs with rifles. As they say, air defense in Russia is only for the chosen ones, and the drones, as you can see, are hitting the target precisely. Let us remind you that earlier the Ukrainian armed forces struck the permanent deployment point of the 448th Missile Brigade of the occupiers in the Kursk region, who are also involved in the attacks on Sumy. And at this time, Crimea was also shaken. The Ministry of Murders in the Russian Federation claims that Crimea was attacked by 2 aircraft-type UAVs. And by the way, deep state analysts claim that the Ukrainian armed forces have started using the latest Ukrainian ultralight UAVs on the front, the B-1 aviation complexes.
The B-1 UAVs are light bombers designed to destroy personnel, home, vehicles, and armored equipment. In addition, it should be noted that these UAVs can destroy the specified targets both at the front line and in the enemy's rear. According to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, these drones can carry various types of munitions, and most importantly, they are equipped with powerful low-noise engines that allow these UAVs to remain airborne for several hours. In addition, the B-1 has increased resistance to electronic warfare systems
Moreover, the Ukrainian army is repelling a daring enemy attack in the Novopavlovsk direction. As you can see, the Russians are launching an attack with more than 24 armored vehicles, several tanks, and more than 12.5 BMPs with infantry. But all of this was shattered to pieces along with the enemy infantry. And while the Ukrainian armed forces are striking the enemy, the Russians are hitting their own. As they say, to make others afraid, at least 8 aerial bombs have been dropped by Russian planes on the Belgorod region since April 11th. One of the villages was attacked twice.
Since the beginning, 2025, according to estimates from the Russian side itself, there have been at least 59 unintended bomb drops, including 44 FABs and 7 UMPBs, as well as 3 missiles that have fallen from Russian planes on both Russian territory and temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. This is evidence that the Russian Federation is effectively facing the issue of the inability to modernize and conduct current major repairs of the Russian Aerospace Forces aircraft due to sectoral sanctions from the United States and EU countries.
Moreover, North Korea continues to assist the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin in his aggressive war against Ukraine. According to Reuters, over the past 2 years, North Korea has sent the Kremlin about 16,000 containers with ammunition.
It should be noted that North Korea supplies the Russian Federation not only with artillery shells. I will emphasize once again, according to the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, this amounts to about 4 million TE artillery shells. But accordingly, we are talking about the supply of KN-23 tactical ballistic missiles. Plus, accordingly, these are strike drones. In addition, the North Korean side also supplies accordingly Koksan 117 self-propelled artillery, and other types of military equipment.
And you remember that North Korea helps Russia not only with ammunition, but also by sending its cannon fodder to the war.
That's all for now. For more fiery news from the front, watch the next episode.